So far, the process we followed to put constraints on tables was to create a brand new table with no constraints, and then alter the table and add constraints. One great advantage for us in doing this is we were able to pick the exact name we wanted our constraint or key to be named. We know that this code would create the primary key at the time that the table was created, but it doesn't give us a chance to pick the name, and we get an auto-generated name, which is really long and hard to deal with. In this section, we will show you how to create and name your constraints and keys as part of your create table statement. Let's create the sales.traveltrip table, and let's create it to have a primary key, and we're going to pick the name of the primary key. Let's go create table sales.traveltrip, and let's put our beginning parenthesis and our ending parenthesis, and we'll put a go right below it since this is a DDL statement. Now up here, let's put the first field, which will be trip ID, which is an integer, and let's say not null. Next, let's say trip name, and that is a varchar 100, and that's nullable. And finally, let's see which employee gets the credit for booking this trip. So we will have an emp ID field, which is an integer, and that is nullable just in case the customer found us. Okay, now normally we would just run this at this point and create the table. The problem is, you can have the same trip ID multiple times with this design, so we want to put a primary key on this field. Now, just typing primary key is not going to let us name the field. So what we're going to do is we're going to go down here and say constraint pk underscore the name of the table, which is travel trip, and then the name of the field we're going to put the constraint on, which is trip ID. Now, you could have called it anything you wanted. This is just the naming convention we're going to follow. Now we're going to say primary key clustered. There we go. Now we're run out of room, so let's get rid of our Object Explorer. And which field is this going to be on? Well, it's going to be on the trip ID field. So in parentheses, put trip ID. Let's go ahead and run this. It says commands completed successfully. Let's look in our Object Explorer. Let's refresh our tables. Go down, and here's the sales.traveltrip table. And it has our 3 columns we see here. Those match up. And notice, yes, there is a primary key on the first field. What is the name of that primary key? Aha. Instead of an auto-generated name, it actually has the name that we chose during the create table statement. So this code did just what we wanted it to do. It created a primary key on the trip ID field, and we got to pick our own naming convention. Now, what if the trip name was not allowed to be duplicated? You know you can't have 2 primary keys on one table, but you can have a unique constraint on the table. So, what we're going to do is put a unique constraint on the trip name field, and we're going to give it its own name. Let's do this. Constraint, and then the name of the constraint will be UQ for unique, the name of the table, and then the name of the field, which is trip name. And let's say unique. Now let's drop the table, and now we can create the table. Let's verify our work in the Object Explorer. Let's expand the columns, and notice we have the same 3 columns we had before, but let's look in our keys. Notice this unique constraint is named just as we specified it in the create table statement. Okay, this has been working great. And the design team said, you know, to keep better track of the trips our customers have taken, we need to know when the trip started, when the trip ended, and we also want to keep track of if there was any complaints. So let's add 3 more fields to this table. The first one will be start date, which is a date time, and that can't be null. And the next one will be end date, which is a date time, and that one can't be null. And then here's a field called complaint, which is a bit. It's either yes or no. And we need to know if they complained or not. So, got those 3 fields. Ready to go? Yeah, we could drop and recreate this. But there's more logic they want. For example, they want to make sure the end date is at least as late or later than the start date. Like, if it's a day trip, then your start date could be March 17th and the end date could be March 17th. But your end date couldn't possibly be March 16th. So let's make sure the end date is as late or later than the start date. That's a good candidate for a check constraint. Well, if we're going to add another constraint, let's put a comma right here, and let's type the word constraint below, and let's say check that the travel trip table has an end date, and we're going to check that the end date is as late or later than the start date. Okay, let's drop the table. Wonderful. Let's create the table. Okay, that looks good. Let's check our Object Explorer. Let's refresh the table. And we can see we have a lot more fields than we used to. We can see the unique key and the primary key is there, as it was before. And now under Constraints, we see the Travel Trip End Date Check constraint, just as we named it in the code. Okay, one more type of constraint to show you while you're creating the table. And that's the foreign key. What would be a good foreign key on this table? Well, if an employee ID is going to get credit for booking the trip, and we only have 16 or 17 employees, we shouldn't give the credit to employee number 80. There is no employee number 80. So what we want to do is make sure that this emp ID field has a foreign key constraint on it at the time the table is created. And we're going to pick the name. Okay, that can be done. Let's put a comma right here because we're starting a new constraint called FK underscore and name it after the table we're locking down, which is travel trip, to reference the employee table against the emp ID. And we're going to say foreign key and then say emp ID, which is the field we're locking down in this table. And we're going to say that field references the employee table's emp ID field. All right? Let's go ahead and drop this table. Let's recreate this table. And again, let's check our Object Explorer. Pulling the Object Explorer up, let's go ahead and refresh the table. And let's see what keys we have. Hey, look at this. The foreign key we created and named in the code is sitting right here. Lab 1.5, Skill Check 1. Create the DBO contestant table and insert the following 3 records seen in the figure below. Your checklist to complete this code should include the following. All fields should not allow nulls. The customer ID field should be the primary key using the naming convention PK underscore table name underscore field name. A check constraint on the gender field should only allow an F or an M. And test that you can verify this by trying to insert O for other in the gender field, and you should get the error you see here.